first 2 minutes of a lesson, like really set the tone for the rest of the lesson. And if you give students both feedback and a grade, then actually they just ignore the feedback and they look at the grade, and it wipes out the effect of all of good feedback. Teacher-led forms of teaching tend to be better for students than like less explicit, like less guided, more kind of like discovery oriented approaches.
Wie funktioniert Lernen wirklich im Gehirn? Und warum widersprechen aktuelle Erkenntnisse der Lernpsychologie so vielem, was wir intuitiv für richtiges Unterrichten halten? Heute spreche ich mit einem der faszinierendsten Denker der aktuellen Bildungsforschung, Peps Mccrea. Als ehemaliger Mathematiklehrer, der heute als einer der führenden Experten für Lehrerbildung gilt, verbindet er kaum wie ein anderer Wissenschaft und Praxis. In diesem Interview räumt er mit den größten Missverständnissen darüber auf, wie das Gehirn beim Lernen wirklich arbeitet. Ich verspreche euch, ihr werdet überrascht sein, welche beliebten Unterrichtsmethoden uns Lehrkräfte in die Irre führen und warum manchmal weniger tatsächlich mehr ist. Peps und ich sprechen im Interview darüber, welche überraschenden Erkenntnisse der Lernforschung die meisten Lehrkräfte nicht kennen, was die Lernpsychologie uns über Motivation wirklich sagt, wie du deine Unterrichtsvorbereitung an den Prinzipien effektiven Lernens ausrichten kannst und warum sich lernwirksamer Unterricht manchmal erstmal falsch anfühlt. Peps gibt uns Einblicke in seine Erfolgskonzepte und erklärt sehr praxisnah, wie wir Erkenntnisse der Lernforschung praktisch im Unterricht umsetzen können. Ich verspreche dir also, du wirst ganz viele Ideen für deinen Unterricht bekommen, die du gleich morgen einsetzen kannst. Das Interview wird eure Sicht auf Lernen und Unterricht verändern, egal ob ihr Berufseinsteiger seid oder schon jahrelang unterrichtet. Ich freue mich sehr, dass ihr eingeschaltet habt und wünsche euch jetzt ganz viel Spaß mit Peps Mccrea. Amazing, Peps. Today I'm very delighted to welcome Peps Mccrea, who is a leading expert in teacher education. You, Peps, are the author of many influential books, among them, for instance, Memorable Teaching, Motivated Teaching, big recommendation from my end. I loved those books. Through your weekly Evidence Next newsletter, you distill complex research into bite-sized insights to help teachers enhance their classroom practice. Overall, your work focuses on helping teachers develop expertise through evidence-informed professional development, something that I feel we are actually lacking in Germany. And you have significantly shaped our understanding of effective teaching practices, particularly in making learning stick and building student motivation. It's a pleasure to have you with us today, Peps.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here with you, Emily, and that's a very kind introduction, so thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm just being honest. I'm a true fan, and I love the work that you do. That's why I'm very happy that I have you with me today. Cool. Perhaps maybe you can introduce yourself a little bit more to the listeners or to the viewers. So, how did you get to where you are today? Can you tell us a little bit more about what you did in the past and what you're actually doing right now?
Sure. Yeah. So I was a teacher myself in the classroom for, I don't know, maybe about 7 years in the south coast of England, in a place called Brighton. After I was a secondary math teacher and a senior leader at various different schools. After that, I went and joined the local university and ran the kind of teacher training program for about another 7 years or so. And then I think about 7 years ago or so, I helped to kind of set up a new university, like a national university for teachers and school leaders called Ambition Institute, which I think is now the kind of largest provider of training, professional training in the UK. And then over the last like kind of 5 years or so, have been working with an organization called Step Lab, which is essentially a suite of videos and tools and content and resources that help schools to basically systematically improve teaching themselves. And so that's kind of where I spend the majority of my time when I'm not like writing newsletters or constructing videos like you do and things like that. Throughout all of that time, I have been obsessed by the research and have basically tried to read everything I possibly can get my hands on that's related to effective teaching. And like you say, I've tried my best to take all of that research and try and condense it into kind of usable, easy to read, concise bits of writing. And so that's what I love to do. And so, yeah, it's a pleasure to be here talking about this stuff with you.
Yeah, it's amazing because especially what you said in the end, like the concising it to the most important things and giving teachers practical tips on what they can implement the next day in their classroom is just something that we need more of. And so I'm very, very happy to receive your newsletter weekly and take many of those ideas into my classrooms as well. Now, you've already said you've spent years studying how teachers can best support learning and what practices we can use in our classroom. What would you say if there was one like biggest surprising finding throughout your journey from educational research that most teachers maybe don't know about, but that could significantly impact their practice? And if there's not one, then maybe 2 or 3 things that you learned along the way that teachers would benefit from.
Yeah. If I was forced, there are a few. There are definitely a few. I think like there's some interesting stuff around memory. There's some interesting stuff around motivation. But if I was forced to choose one, I think it's basically the power of routines. Okay, and I think like we as teachers tend to underestimate, or at least aren't necessarily as a profession always aware of just the massive power that routines can kind of bring to our classrooms and more generally around school. Routines, a bit like habits, are essentially like sequences of actions that get triggered by a cue or a prompt. A bit like when your alarm clock goes off in the morning and you jump up out of bed and brush your teeth and have a shower and have breakfast and go off to work. Or if you drive, when you come up to a junction, you drop down through the gears, you press the clutch and the brake, you pop on the indicator, look in the mirror, loads of complex actions, all with minimal thought. Whenever these things are in place in school, when routines are in place in school, it essentially allows our students to basically achieve more with less. And they are able to do that because routines essentially allow them to deploy more of their kind of precious attention, because our attention is kind of finite. It allows our students to deploy more of that precious attention to the content of their learning and less towards the process of their learning. So instead of thinking, oh, what's going to happen now? What should we do next? They can be thinking like, much more about the fractions themselves, or coastal drift, or whatever the concept it is that students are learning. And when we have routines in place, it makes it easier for students to do the right thing. It creates a more familiar and safe environment, which helps students with special educational needs. It also creates a kind of like shared ritual, which can increase feelings of belonging, which we know support well-being in school. And finally, it also frees up like teacher cognitive capacity, so we can monitor the classroom better and respond to individual needs as they arise. So there's this like massive suite of benefits that comes with like having routines in place that I think we sometimes tend to underestimate a little bit. Routines can sometimes have like a much worse reputation as things like kind of boredom, like brokers. It's routines are really boring, or they kind of like inhibit creativity. But the opposite is absolutely true. When students have good routines in place, they tend to learn more and be more successful, and as a result be like even more motivated. And whenever good routines are in place, again, it frees up student attention to be able to like spend more of their precious attention on being imaginative, which leads to greater creativity. So there's lots of kind of paradoxes in there that I think mean that routines are way more powerful than we tend to think.
Yeah, amazing. That's what I also experience actually. Whenever I implement a routine in my classroom, I feel like learning goes more smoothly. Everybody, myself knows more exactly what to do. And it's very interesting to me because my son is, he's at daycare, and I feel like the younger the kids, the more routines they have, like in their day-to-day lives, or they also, the people who care for the children focus more on routines rather than older, like high school teachers, for instance. And I think it's very inspirational what they do. They have like a strict structure or a strict plan for the day, and it really works for the young kids. Would you say there's a difference between younger and older kids? So maybe for teachers working at primary schools, is it more important to implement routines? Does that change in high school? Or would you say it's just a strategy that every teacher, no matter the age of their students, should use or implement?
Yeah. So I'd say that it's a strategy that works for everyone, including adults, right? Because we all share a kind of similar cognitive architecture, similar cognitive kind of apparatus. And we all have a limited working memory capacity, or a limited capacity to be able to pay attention to stuff. Multitasking is a myth. People who claim to multitask aren't really multitasking. They're just like task switching very, very quickly, which is an inefficient way to get anything done and a very poor way to learn. And so because everyone, regardless of our age, has a limited attentional capacity, when we have routines in place, we all experience those kind of same benefits. Now, I think one of the kind of key things to call out is that what we don't want in our lessons is just kind of one big formula for the whole lesson. It's probably better to think of us having like a repertoire of routines that we pull out for different occasions, different needs, different situations, but so that the overall student experience is one that's kind of more one of familiarity rather than one of novelty. Like absolutely, novelty does have an important place in school, but it's probably like quite a small one in reality.
Maybe I would love to be a bit more concrete at this point. Can you, because if young teachers, for instance, are watching, or teachers who haven't really implemented routines in their classrooms yet, where should they start? Because sometimes I feel like there's so much you have to focus on in your classroom. You have to take care about like having good instructions. You need to make sure that the students understand it. You need good materials. You need blah, 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 all these kinds of stuff. Now, where should I start to implement a routine if I want it to be successful, and maybe where not?
Yeah. So the kind of two main buckets of routines that are kind of important to have a bit of both. So we've got like logistical or behavioral routines, such as like how you get students into your class, how you get students sat down on the mat if you're at primary school, how you get students to distribute resources or gather in books or give out books, like all of how you get students to leave the classroom, like all of these routines, if you refine them and like repeat them and reinforce them enough, they will all create more time for learning within a given day. Okay, so you'll end up like, if you have all these routines in place, everything will be much slicker. There'll be much less friction. There'll be much fewer behavior issues because all of this stuff kind of happens automatically, and you'll just end up with more time for learning. Okay, but you also need like more instructional type routines, such as how you call everyone to silence and to listen to you, such as how you ask questions in the class, such as how you set up students for practice, such as how you give specific feedback or provide rewards, and all of those kinds of routines kind of maximize the amount of learning that we can do within the time that we have left. So you probably want to think about both types of routines. And so if I was to basically start working with a teacher on this, I think the first thing we'd look at is the way they get students into the classroom, because I think this sets the tone. Like the first 2 minutes of a lesson, like really set the tone for the rest of the lesson. And so like simple things such as being at the door to greet students, setting the tone using your facial expression and carefully chosen words for every student, making sure that students know exactly where to go, and having an activity for them to get on with as soon as they get in, with clear expectations of what to do. Like getting all of that kind of honed down and really, really right would be a classic kind of routine to get nailed down. And then in terms of an instructional routine, a call for silence is probably the most important one. What is your signal for making sure that every student listen to you, in a really quick and efficient way? And often the things, I'm sure that it's the same in Germany, but in the UK, the things that work are like having a really clear countdown with a visual cue. You maybe stand somewhere different in the classroom and you use your hands as well as changing the tone of your voice in like eyes on me in 3, 2, 1. Whatever it is. And so kind of working on refining that routine. And then I think if you wanted to start to take things to the next level, I think the kind of one of the ripest areas for improvement is around formative assessment, or how we check for student understanding. And often as teachers, we can fall into the kind of habit of just asking individual students, what's the answer to this? Or do you understand that? Or even just saying, does everyone get it? and just seeing a sea of kind of blank faces. Whereas it's much more effective to kind of adopt whole class questioning strategies, such as putting a multiple choice question on the board that has like a picture of like a 1 finger, 2 finger, or 3 fingers beside each option, and asking the whole class, in 3, hold up your answer to the multi-choice question, 3, 2, 1, show me, and getting like the whole class, a whole sea of hands holding up their answers. And that can give you instant feedback on what every single student in the classroom knows or doesn't know. And so that can put you in a much stronger position to make a decision about whether to go back and reteach or whether to move on and give them some practice. And there are lots of different ways you can do this kind of whole class questioning, like finger voting is one. The use of mini whiteboards is another really powerful way to do that. They're like used a lot in effective classrooms in the UK. True false questions, giving your students a true false question and asking them to like true, false, or don't know. Heads down, thumbs up is another great one. Asking a question and getting every student to put their head on the table and putting their thumbs up or their thumbs down if they know the answer. This is amazing because it reduces the kind of stigma associated with answering the question. So students aren't embarrassed about saying that they don't know, or aren't scared to try and get the question wrong because nobody else is seeing the answer. So yeah, that's I think is one of the most powerful kind of assessment strategies. Although you do have to make sure you've got a strong culture in the classroom where students feel like doing things like that they know are going to be good for their learning, and they're not going to be embarrassed because it looks silly or whatever.
Yeah, amazing. So many valuable examples. Thank you, Peps. 2 more things that I was thinking about, because I try to implement routines as well in my classroom. And one very, very big pain point that I think every teacher on this planet, no matter where they are, can relate to is the time it takes to pass around worksheets. And I've tried multiple things. So I passed them around. I was walking, like almost running through the classroom, passing around the worksheets. Then I handed out some here and then some there. And then I started passing out them as well at the same time to save time. And that would be something to actually, I think, practice maybe in the very first lesson that you see your students, practice how they can pass around worksheets efficiently and as fast as possible in order to save time. So that would be, I would say then, logistical routines rather, right, than instructional, as you said. And another one that also relates to, I think, effective learning is quizzing. So what I try to do in my classroom as like almost any beginning of my lesson, I start with a short quiz, a short test that sometimes I take home and I correct, or sometimes I just tell them this is for yourself to see where you need improvement. And then so I have some test questions, and they answer them on their own, and then they switch worksheets, and then they correct their peers' worksheets, for instance, and then they see where they are. And this is something that really helped me to also learn where my students are and help them to improve their learning and to bring like knowledge into their long-term memory. At least that's the idea behind it. So very, very powerful ideas. Thank you, Peps. Right. One more thing that I wanted to ask. Is there anything else that was surprising to you when you did a deep dive on education research? Evidence-based teaching. So something that teachers have to learn or have a misconception of. Anything else than the
oh my God,
importance
there's
of
so
routine?
much. There's so much, Emily. This is like a lifetime's worth of work. Wow. Should I just list off some things?
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, and in no particular order, okay. I'm sure your listeners are very aware of the power of retrieval practice. So, that this is whenever we get students to like think about a thing that they've learned previously, and when we get them to kind of do that in a way that forces them to kind of pull the information out of their minds as much as possible, rather than we as teachers presenting the information to them. And so that seems to have a really big impact on their ability to both understand and remember. And if we do retrieval practice repeatedly with increasing intervals between each time we do it, we like maximize their ability to be able to recall. And when students remember, they're able to apply that understanding to learn more stuff. So that's like probably number one. That's one of the areas of like kind of science of learning that has the strongest evidence base behind it. Second big thing to just like chuck out there is that we'll jump over to motivation for a second. The thing that seems to have the biggest impact on student motivation is like student success rates. Okay, sometimes we assume that like motivation is the thing you need to have in place for students to be successful, but actually the reality is that that's a very kind of like bi-directional relationship. We can boost student motivation by making sure that our students feel really successful, and that's all the kind of stuff that I'm sure your audience knows lots about. Explaining clearly, breaking things down, providing lots of opportunities for practice with feedback, etc., etc., etc. But it also entails us like making sure that we kind of frame success for our students. We explain to them what success looks like in our lessons, because if they kind of have a belief that's different to our own, for example, if you teach a lesson where your students are all like asking loads of questions and helping each other, making mistakes but learning from it, you think it's really successful, but in your students' heads, they think that success means getting all of the questions done first time without making any mistakes and beating their peers. Then you're going to have this kind of like disconnect in terms of understanding of success. So as well as like teaching really effectively, you also have to tell your students what success looks like. Probably more often than you think, because as teachers we have this like expert-induced blindness that means that we tend to struggle to empathize with people who don't know what we know. So that'll be like the second big thing. And then third big thing I say is like the power of social norms in the classroom. So as a species, we are heavily influenced by the behavior and attitudes of those people around us within our kind of group, as it were, way more than we tend to, than we'd like to think, really. And social norms are so powerful that they tend to like completely override formal school rules or policies. And so if you want to try and like change behavior or attitudes within the school, then really social norms are that kind of route to achieving that. And the best way to kind of nudge or influence social norms is by trying to amplify those attitudes and behaviors that you want other students to adopt. So it's basically like making a big deal of the good stuff, catching students being good. So like, Jessica's come in and she's got on really well. Peter has come in and that's like a really good entrance, or whatever it is. Telling stories of like, do you remember last time like we did this, or my other class did this, raising the visibility of the behaviors and attitudes that you want other people to adopt. And if you kind of do that consistently over time, you will start to kind of shape attitudes and behavior. So that's really powerful too.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you for those examples. Maybe one thing that I want to do a little deep dive on is what I've learned in the last couple of years is that I, as a teacher, always have to think to myself, you don't tell them, teach them. So there's a difference in telling them, for instance, that mistakes are a good way for improving and a good way of learning. And then there's a way to teach them that mistakes are actually a good sign that you are learning and improving. So how can I teach my students that mistakes are a good thing?
Yeah, so telling like only goes so far, which I think is good insight. When we want to like teach somebody something, I suppose like a good analogy is if you wanted to try and teach somebody to surf or to ride a bicycle, okay, you wouldn't just tell them. You wouldn't just be like, right, put your feet on here, turn this way. When the wave comes, like paddle or whatever it is. Like telling people isn't enough, and there are many aspects of kind of behavior in school which are exactly the same. You can't just like tell a student that making mistakes is fine as long as you learn from them. We've got to teach them, and that involves doing the same things that we do for surfing or like helping somebody to ride a bike. It involves telling and explaining why. Okay, so making mistakes are fine. It's a natural part of life, and if you share those mistakes with the class, then everyone will learn from them. And then you kind of got to model that as well. So but again, like kind of teaching somebody to surf, you got to show them an example of that in practice. And so that can either be you as a teacher making mistakes and showing your students how you respond to that, or it can ideally be picking up mistakes from the class and like with the students' consent and their kind of agreement, sharing those with the class and talking through with the class how this can help them to improve. And then, of course, as well as modeling, we need to provide lots of opportunities for practice. So, you just have to basically, every time a student makes a mistake, see it as an opportunity and seize it to basically show the class that nothing bad's going to happen in this situation. We're all going to learn lots from it. And we're going to all celebrate that student who was brave enough to share their kind of learning with the whole class. And if you do that time and time again, if you do the telling with an explanation, plus a model, plus practice, and probably a bit of feedback and reinforcement along the way, then you'll get to a point where your students feel like it's a environment where they can and actually enjoy making mistakes over time. And as a result, you kind of increase learning.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting thing. What my problem with that, or like really teaching my students that mistakes are a good thing, it works for me in my like regular classes. I feel like they are more open to mistakes and they learn to learn from them rather than hating doing mistakes. But there's a big contradiction for me at my school, for instance, because I have grades, right? So I practice with my students along the way, and then the goal is the exam or the 2 exams that we write in the first 6 months. And in that exam, mistakes are actually a bad thing. Do you know what I mean? So there's like a big contradiction to what I'm saying to them in class and then what actually happens to them when they receive their maybe bad grade. Is there anything that a teacher could do who works in a system like that in order to help students to deal with that better, maybe?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. Like there are some, if grades or exams or tests, for a better word, if we don't handle them carefully, they can have a negative impact on student learning, and there are kind of a variety of ways that can happen. The kind of often it's associated with the perceived stakes that the student associates with the kind of test or exam. So if the student thinks that the test or exam is like the most important thing that they've ever done in their life, then that's not often a good thing, because it will induce like a high emotional response, often like anxiety or fear, and that emotional response can kind of hijack like part of that precious attention that they have, and as a result, they tend to perform poorer. At the same time, where the stakes are too low, where students feel like it doesn't matter, I don't care, it doesn't matter what happens in this test, actually they will also not perform as well as they can. So there's this kind of like upside down U shape where there's like a sweet spot in the middle where this kind of test or exam is just important enough for me to like put in sufficient effort, but not too important so that I get like, really anxious about it. And so that's kind of part of the strategy for schools, is like learning what works for their students and making sure that they don't pitch it too far in either direction. And then I think you can also make sure that you treat tests as an opportunity to provide feedback. So we've known for a long time that when you give students, if you just give students grades, like it doesn't have a massive impact on their learning. If you just give students feedback, if you, instead of giving them a grade, you just say, here's how you can do better next time, like that has a much more positive impact on their kind of future performance. So that's a better thing to do. And if you give students both feedback and a grade, then actually they just ignore the feedback and they look at the grade, and it wipes out the effect of all of good feedback. So, ideally what we would do is try to not give students grades at all and just give them feedback for how they could improve in the future. But I'm aware that kind of would require a large culture shift in some schools. And of course, parents may sometimes expect to know grades and all sorts of things. So this isn't necessarily easy to do, but it's important to kind of understand the theory, I suppose, so that you can apply it wherever you get the opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting point. So I've personally not have found or I haven't come up with an opinion yet on the topic of grades, because there's strong opinions for and against it. I think there are strong arguments on both sides. Mm-hmm. So judging from what you're saying, you're rather team getting rid of grades at school, even though, as you just described, and this is something that I'm thinking about a lot, is we need some sort of pressure, or there's like the good kind of stress that we maybe have that has an impact on our performance and on our learning improvement. If we maybe feel like this little amount of stress, whereas if we get rid of grades, we might get lost of that little tiny amount of stress, or is that not connected in any way? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I'd say there's probably a connection there. I think it depends what you're doing with those grades. Like, you could say that students don't need grades until they like leave school, or until there's a major decision that needs to be made based on their kind of like performance. Like, other than that, the only person who needs to know the grade really is the teacher, so they can teach accordingly. The student doesn't really need to know their grade. And when like giving students grades can begin to make them believe that learning is all about kind of achieving a grade rather than improving. So there's kind of like, in the research, it's called like a performance orientation versus a mastery orientation, which basically means like the reason you learn is either to like get a good grade or just to like get better. And the research is pretty overwhelming in that when students believe that it's all about them just improving, they improve more. Surprise, surprise. And so, yeah, I think like if you just looked at the evidence, it would probably suggest to us that as teachers, it's probably better to like not make a big deal of grades and kind of withhold them as much as possible. Instead, just provide students with feedback to help them get better, except for those times where we actually need to give them grades because it informs like an important future decision for them or an employer or another school or for their education or something like that.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. I've heard of a school in Chicago. I think they have the grading system ABC and not yet. And
Right.
So students have the chance to make up for bad grades, or if they haven't learned it yet, they can rewrite the test or the exam. Of course, that's logistically a bit of a challenge. Cannot imagine that to be easily implemented in any school, but still, I think it's an interesting concept. Okay, so we talked about good things that teachers can do or should do in their classroom in order to enhance learning in their students. Are there any teaching practices that may be a bit more ineffective that teachers tend to do? Because I think it's a good thing and it helps my students to learn, but that in the end, doesn't really do anything good for their students' learning. Anything that where maybe teachers now, while listening or watching, can view themselves and be like, I tend to do that. Maybe I should get rid of it.
Yeah. Okay, well, I tend to focus more on things that teachers can do to improve rather than things that they aren't doing so well. But if I was pushed on this, I'd say that one of the things that has become increasingly clear in the research is that basically more explicit forms of teaching, or more heavily guided forms of teaching, or more teacher-led forms of teaching tend to be better for students than like less explicit, like less guided, more kind of like discovery oriented approaches. So I think I've definitely been in schools, and I've definitely kind of felt myself that the best way to help my students to learn was for them to discover it for themselves. But the evidence really doesn't support this notion at all. It's whenever we kind of try to help our students learn through discovery or inquiry methods, often what happens is they are more prone to coming up with an error-laden understanding. So they basically end up with like a more or less accurate understanding, and those students in the class who know the most will end up like having a much better outcome than those students who don't. So basically, like it widens the gap in the classroom as well. So it's not very good for like learning generally, and it's not very good for equity. So it's not very equitable practice. Even though it like feels better, like in our hearts, we want to just like have this classroom where our students are discovering lots of stuff because it just it feels more romantic. It feels like kind of more liberating, I suppose. But the evidence suggests that if we really want to do the best for our students, then it works best when we kind of break content down into lots of little bits, and we are really explicit. We explain really clearly to them. We provide them lots of opportunities to kind of rehearse, practice and apply and provide lots and lots of checking for understanding and feedback along the way. So it's really kind of very tightly managed, really carefully broken down, and there's just not a lot of kind of room for them to go wrong, I suppose. One misconception about kind of more explicit forms of teaching is that it's just all about the teacher telling the students, like doing a lecture, but it's not. Like, the best forms of explicit teaching are highly interactive. There's kind of lots of questioning and lots of checking for understanding, and lots of kind of short, snappy explanations and rehearsal that go on. So it is a very engaging experience for students, and as a result, they, not only are they tend to be more successful and as a result feel more motivated about school, but they are often end up like participating more. And when students are kind of like encouraged or forced, I suppose, if you're like doing like a whole class interactive teaching approach, when they're kind of nudged to participate more, they end up developing in confidence as well. So you can kind of get gains both for learning and for like character, I suppose, as it were.
Yeah, very interesting. What about projects then? So if I want to, or there's in didactics or in our teacher trainings, we learn what projects are good things. Students should explore, I don't know, a topic on their own or in a small group, and then create some sort of product at the end, present it. And what is it? I mean, is it still good to do that? What do I have to do as a teacher in advance in order to help my students actually be successful in doing the project? Or would you say just get rid of projects then?
Yeah, I think like again, the evidence suggests that projects can be useful, but only really where students have a strong grasp of kind of most of the ideas that they're working with. So it's kind of like projects work at the kind of more expert end of the spectrum. And so, projects aren't good for helping pupils to kind of develop basic ideas or to like, learn the fundamentals. But when they have a good grasp, they can sometimes be like a useful device for getting students to apply that knowledge and to kind of like extend it a little bit. But it still creates this kind of like openness for students to head off in all sorts of different directions, which can like exacerbate this gap. You can then, often it's those students who are the kind of who have the most prior knowledge and who are the most confident who end up getting the most from things like projects. And so it kind of depends on your philosophy of education, I suppose, whether you care about trying to get everyone, to like learn as much as they can, or whether you're like happy for those students who know the most to go off and maybe learn even more.
Yeah, maybe scaffolding could also be an important thing in that, right? Like or some sort of guidance or like check-ins in between during a project, seeing where they're going, which direction, what maybe misconception that they have, or but yeah, still it's a challenging thing, especially if you have big groups of students. So in Germany, we have like around 30 students in a class, and it's very, very hard as one teacher for 30 students to really see what they're working on and where they're in, which direction they're going in, and if everyone is invested in in the right way.
It's really hard.
Yeah.
And group work itself is like provides all sorts of opportunities for kind of learning to go wrong, and for some students to get more out of it than others. Sometimes you kind of get a social loafing effect where one student in a group will like let the other students do more of the work or more of the fair share, and as a result they don't benefit as much from it. So like group work again is one of those things that it has the potential to be effective, but only really if it's set up highly with like lots of structure and the teacher's really, really skilled. And so group work is one of those things that can just be done really, really badly, and sometimes is often is probably done really badly. And one of those things, a bit like project-based learning, that's probably best done when the conditions are right, I suppose, when you've got a really skilled teacher and there's like a good deal of structure in place, scaffolding, as you say.
Yeah, maybe one tiny hack for group works, because I know teachers, I love group work myself. Sometimes I see how ineffective it is what they're doing in the moment, but still, whatever, I do it. But do you have one like tiny hack that teachers can use in order to make group works more effective?
Yeah, so I think like reducing the amount of time that you give students to kind of work on something, and then doing it more frequently. Okay, if that makes sense. So rather than like giving students like a big group work task for like 10 minutes or so, it's probably much more effective for you to kind of lead them through the whole activity and giving them like 30 seconds of like paired discussion time at like multiple opportunities. So that allows you to have much more control over the situation, to make sure that your students are thinking, paying attention to the right things at the right times. And just like, yeah, it massively increases the chances that they're going to end up learning things. And so, yeah, getting students to kind of like discuss in pairs, to either rehearse an idea or to answer a question, and like doing that multiple times, kind of like short little blasts, I think is probably going to be a much more effective way of like, yeah, getting students to learn and interact with each other than just saying like, here's 10 minutes, crack on with it.
Yeah. Yeah, amazing. Peps, this has been very fascinating. Thank you for all of your valuable insights, your ideas, your concrete examples. I know now I feel like we only scratched the surface. There's so much more we can talk about, which is why I'm very excited to have you back actually for a next conversation where we will do a little deep dive into how teachers in schools can actually now systematically improve their practice, especially through approaches like instructional coaching where you're, invested in with Step Lab, for instance. And I'm very much looking forward to talking to you again. And thank you again for sharing your insights.
My pleasure.